It's my pleasure today to introduce two people, Dan Fiscus and Brian Fath. They're going to co-lead this discussion and this presentation. If you have questions, you can put those in the chat window at any time, but certainly at the end, we're going to save some time for a discussion, but it'll be via the chat window, so you can ask your questions, and then we'll moderate those. So Dan Fiscus is a scholar with the Research Alliance for Regenerative Economics, where he researches sustainability, systems ecology, and food systems. He has degrees in electrical engineering, ecology, mathematics, and a PhD in environmental science. He is also a member of the Western Maryland Food Council, where he works to increase local and sustainable food production in the Western Maryland region. Brian Fath is a professor of biological sciences at Towson University. He is editor-in-chief of Ecological Modeling, has authored or edited several books and over 100 scientific papers. And while he's teaching courses at Towson, Brian specializes in systems ecology, network analysis, and sustainability. So both Dan and Brian are here today to talk about their work and their collaboration, and in particular, their most recent collaboration, which is a book called Foundations for Sustainability, a Coherent Framework for Life-Environment Relations. So thank you very much, Dan and Brian, and I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. Brian Fath, I'm professor at Towson University, just up the road from SASync. I've been down there a couple of times. It's a great facility you have, so thanks again for the invitation. I'm also a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. A little bit difficult traveling these days over there, but it's a nice place to work also. So with that, let me turn it over to Dan.
Thanks to Andrew for the invitation and opportunity, and also Dr. Palmer and everyone at SASync. It's great to be here speaking with you all today, and happy fall equinox if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. As Andrew said, I'm an ecologist and sustainability researcher, and Brian and I are going to talk about our book today, and we want to share the ideas in it with you and hopefully spark some discussions. We're going to take turns presenting. Our talk is mostly conceptual, so we're going to present kind of the big ideas of the book, and most importantly, our proposal or a case for the need for a paradigm shift and revised foundations for science. The book itself also has a major chapter and a section on quantitative methods and ecological network analysis, but we're only going to mention that briefly today. So if we start to look at the overview of the talk today, it's our effort to synthesize understanding we've gleaned over about 25 years of work each in environmental science and related fields. We wanted to distill the most important synthesis related to human-environment relationship. You could also think of this as the socio-environment relationship, and we're trying to make this relevant to SASync. So we start out looking at foundational first principles, sustainability and foundations of science. We're going to borrow and credit and cite the work of many others, but what we think is new or most underemphasized is this focus that the paradigm shift could be a strategy for solving the problems of environmental sustainability. So throughout the talk, it's a tale of these two paradigms where the goal is to advance solutions to the global ecological crisis. When we look at these two and contrast what we call conventional science with holistic life science, we're not trying to say one is correct and the other is invalid. We're trying to see them as complementary, but right now unbalanced. We again going to try to frame this in terms of socio-environmental synthesis and actionable science. We recognize SASync as a leading center for synthesis, and we seek comments, critique, and ideally collaboration in the future. I think that's your turn next, Brian.
Okay. So obviously one of the main themes of the book is about sustainability. It's actually something that we're not going to get into too much in this particular talk, but some of the things that we raise in the book are things basically like, what does it really mean for a system to be sustainable? What are some of the features that make the system sustainable? What role do humans play in this whole thing? And can we even be sustainable given current population and resource use levels? And so these are all some of the big questions that we're not going to talk about today, but obviously are important in the general air all the time and addressed in the book. But the one thing I will say that's in the book that it's a point that I'm trying to get across to as many audiences as I can, is this difference between sustainable development and sustainability. Sustainable development we all associate with the Brundtland Report that came out now several decades ago, where there's this very beautiful, eloquent statement about development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's essentially a textbook definition of sustainable development. It tells us how to development. It's politically powerful. It's useful. It helps to build consensus. And I think that's a lot of good value comes from that. But the critique that I have, or at least the differentiation that I have, is that, first of all, a lot of the heavy lifting in that phrase comes from the not defining what our needs are and pushing that out to a few further discussions so that therefore we can agree on this nice sounding statement without having to get into the details. But that's fine. That's the way political statements often work. But on that then, building a little deeper, is the idea that it's our needs, meaning human needs. And so it's a very anthropocentric concept. So I always try to use sustainable development only when I'm talking about how humans are developing their needs and their actions, right? So it's about humans. Whereas sustainability, I actually like to think of as a broader concept. You can even just go to Wikipedia. It's how any system endures. And so what's the capacity to endure? And that includes human systems, but also includes ecological systems and the red spot on Jupiter, or whatever you want to talk about that's a system that has some self-organizing aspects and properties to it. So I'll leave you with that as a teaser about sustainability in the book, and just we'll go ahead and move on to what the main theme that Dan mentioned was about the foundations and the paradigm differentiation.
So as we start trying to get more specific about the foundations of science and also looking at the global ecological crisis, we propose that it's important to see the problems we're facing right now as systemic, not easily understood in isolation, but more interconnected and interdependent. And so this is why we're emphasizing holistic approach, needed to balance analysis. Many people think of this crisis that we're in right now as being an environmental crisis or a human one, but we're going to talk about it as also potentially a crisis for science itself. And there have been papers written about this with that term of the crisis narrative in science. And one of the aspects that comes up is that sometimes the solutions that are generated through the conventional science paradigm create problems which can be often worse than the original problem. The second part of the foundations that we get into and focus on a lot throughout the book and today has to do with being very specific about how we see the world. So you can think of it as a lens, you can think of it as a mental model. We use the term paradigm in science. It's also a worldview. And this is important because it can often determine or make or break whether or not you can understand or communicate with other people. Peter Elbow described this eloquently in a book that he wrote in 1986. Since perception and cognition are processes in which the organism constructs what it sees or thinks according to models already there, the organism tends to throw away or distort material that doesn't fit the model. So we'll use that idea a lot and try to use it to benefit. One of the third and sort of last foundational idea I'll talk about right now that we see as really important is that we think science can benefit from an explicit value basis. You may hear or think of science as needing to be value neutral, but we think of a certain kind of value basis centered on life as not being a problematic kind of value basis. It's not a bias because it applies to everyone. And when we say life, we're using this capital L life, and we'll define it later, but it means the life environment as a unit. I think we should be able to say science in the service of what? And we're proposing that science should be in the service of life, first and foremost. The traditional scientific goal of learning and knowledge is often obviously critical as well, as long as we can preserve life. And Aldo Leopold said it very concisely and eloquently. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. We see this to apply to science as well as anything else. So we said at the start that we're going to focus a lot on the paradigm of science, and this is where we got this idea. This is from Donella Meadows, famous systems modeler, made many great contributions, and she wrote this paper in 1999. She listed the top 12 sources of leverage for change in a complex system. So this would fit with a socioeconomic system. And both of her number 1 and number 2 sources of leverage for change are about the paradigm. And she went on to say how the rest of the aspects of a system, like the goals, the structure, even the material stocks and flows, all emerge out of the paradigm. And we're going to follow her lead throughout this talk in the book, and then try to come up with ways to consider alternative paradigm and how to test that one might be better than another. One way to see the relationship between the paradigm and its impact on the environment and the real world is to look at architecture and city design through history. And you can see how the physical structures actually emerge out of the shared cultural values. So medieval European cities, often dominated by churches, a time period that was highly religious. The church might be the largest building right in the center of everything. Later in the 19th and 20th centuries, governance and democracy are important. You might have the courthouse, the county seat, the capital being the center of the city. And then currently now, oftentimes the center of the culture has to do with commerce, business, economics, financial district, and that can shape the physical environment. So we're going to use that idea, and it's not always that the scientific paradigm is something conscious. It's not at the top of your mind, maybe. It may be something more that's unspoken or assumed. While that can be true, we also think it's possible to consciously examine our own paradigm, beliefs, and worldview. The conscious and the subconscious, or the paradigm level, they are connected, so we have access to that, and we think that's important. As we start to get into specifics of contrasting these two paradigms, the one that we describe, if you want to go on to the next one, Brian, the two that we're describing, and again, the goal here is to try to solve the global ecological crisis. And also, again, we're not saying one of these is correct and the other one's invalid, but we think of the conventional science paradigm as going back to Descartes and Newton. It focuses on reductionist methods, analysis, objective views, mechanistic approach, usually looks inward and downward to explain complex phenomena. What we're calling holistic life science, others use similar terms. We've seen it to emerge through ecological network analysis, systems ecology. It's kind of the opposite or complementary, holistic, synthetic, intersubjective, and organic. Often looks outward and upward to explain complex phenomena. And we can start to look at how these two different approaches are similar and different when confronting the global ecological crisis. And this is how we think of the state of the world that we're in right now. At least these 10 crises, each of which in its own self could be a gigantic crisis: climate disruption, mass species extinction, disruption of nitrogen cycle, on and on. The conventional science approach is often to pick an area to focus on, like the climate disruption, and to narrow the focus, understand what's the cause of that. Obviously, that's important. We do have to understand the cause of climate disruption, and again, both of these paradigms are important. But we think the holistic approach is different and necessary and valuable. So the holistic science, life science approach would be to broaden the view rather than to narrow it, and to ask, what do all of these symptoms of global environmental degradation have in common? And that's what we're trying to understand, is could there be a shared common root cause? And again, following Meadows, does this have something to do with the paradigm? So we use the term holistic, but we're not saying that to always lump or unify everything. There are times when it's important to make distinctions or separate things. We do unify life and environment together as a single entity, but in other cases, we will point to some important distinctions here's one example. So in our book, we talk about these two hypothetical cultural types of people. This is just a very generalized thought model to use. And we talk about sustainers and transcenders. So these could be two different types of people who would be confronted with the very same evidence, the very same reality of environmental limitations or problems, but they have totally opposite way of dealing with that. So the sustainers, as we're describing them, see the problems that we're in and they want to accept the limits, change our lifestyle, live within those limits and mimic nature. Transcenders, though, this other group sees the same evidence but refuses to accept any limits, seeks to transcend those limits, is motivated to break barriers, modify nature even more, and change the environment to fit with human needs.
Okay, and another place where we see this dichotomy between the analytic and the holistic approaches are something as basic as the question of what is life. When we think of life, we usually think of something like a living organism, has all these necessary properties to be alive, it reproduces, it replicates, and so on. But we think of that as being discrete life, as being a valid way of looking at life. But again, it needs a complementary holistic perspective, because we know that life is actually full of interactions and interdependence. And unfortunately, that's not an elephant picture, but this is some of the artwork that's in the book, showing explicitly that the biomass of the carnivore is actually part of the rest of the ecosystem, right? So when we did look at our discrete life model, recognizing that it is intimately tied to the other parts of the ecosystem or the environment, let me say, and all the other ecological interactions that it needs to persist. And therefore, that is, in fact, an ecosystem by definition. An interacting ecological community and its environment is the ecosystem. So we actually say that the ecosystem possesses all the necessary aspects to sustain life. So discrete life is a living organism, but it's not sustained. Each discrete life element will perish at some point, but sustained life can continue at least at a longer time scale. And when we look at this life environment system as a unified whole, we do think that there's more opportunity for these win-win outcomes, where instead of having tragedy of the commons, but you actually have bounty of the commons, where both humans win and environment improves. And one of the things we set up in the book is even a thought model is this hyperset equation, where we have life environment, which is defined as a subset of the environment, which is a subset of that is ecosystem, and then organisms, but at the center of that again is the environment, right? So we've got atoms inside organisms, inside ecosystems, inside environment. So the fact that environment shows up twice means that it's reflective. It needs to be considered at both scales. And evidence is that we see this, right? Natural living systems do self-organize and self-repair. Some of the examples that we addressed were things like the oxygen atmosphere, which improved the conditions for life over time, leading then into the ozone layer, which improved conditions, the soil formation, water purification, and so on. And this is the normal behavior, is that that life improves the conditions, that the life environment interactions actually improve the conditions, and we get increased biodiversity, we get increased complexity, increased just performance of the system. So one of those things we talked about was the oxygen atmosphere. Oxygen was actually discovered in the late 18th century by Joseph Priestley. You've probably all heard the story where he put a candle in a closed container, and after some time the candle extinguished, and that led him to believe that there was something in that space, in that air, that was necessary for the candle. And we know what that is now, is it's the oxygen which is produced by the photosynthesis of the plants, or the lungs of the planet, which we are now clear cutting. That's another story. But in his experiments, he put some plant material in, and he saw that you could actually continue burning this candle as long as there was now a coupling of the two processes, essentially a respiration and a photosynthesis. And he did the same experiment with the mouse. I don't advise that you do this at home. But again, you can keep adding more and more biomass, more photosynthetic activity to sustain a system that has both of those processes. Okay, so that's one example of those improvements over time. Let's jump back a little bit even further. We talked about Descartes and Newton as being part of the foundations here, and we all know this very famous contribution that Descartes had about "I think, therefore I am." Really was the founder of the Cartesian worldview. And there's a really good book that came out recently by Capra and Luisi, Systems View of the World, and they have this quote that I apologize for an extended quote, but it's really well said. I've got to close my window so I can read it here, right? To Descartes, the material universe was a machine and nothing but a machine. This mechanical picture of nature became the dominant paradigm of science in the period following Descartes. The Cartesian view of the universe as a mechanical system provided a scientific sanction for the manipulation and exploitation of nature that became typical of modern civilization. And the Cartesian approach has been very successful, especially in biology, but has also limited the directions of scientific research. The problem has been that many scientists, encouraged by their success in treating living organisms as machines, tended to believe that they are nothing but machines. And so we've gone too far with this approach that we've essentially turned the world into the machine because our mental model has pictured it as a machine. Machines have this problem that they run down, they wear out, they run out of fuel, they have all sorts of problems, but that's not typical behavior of natural living systems. What we see out in nature is things degrading and things getting more complex and things self-repairing and self-organizing. And so we've got this really strong contrast between the mental model, which is saying everything is a machine and running down, and we see degradation in the world, and so that reinforces it. But on the other hand, we see nature, which is degrading and improving, and we're not able to make that connection. So one way that we were proposing in the book is to again have these complementary views. That what Descartes was promoting was discrete thought, and it's very important. We learn a lot about the world by using discrete thought, but we need a complementary approach. Which we say, what if Descartes would have come after Priestley, and he would have had the knowledge that we know about the interconnections of life that he didn't have access to back when he was writing? Maybe his statement would have said something like, "I think, therefore I exist." That is, I think now, therefore I exist now. But I think only as long as I have a steady input of oxygen, water, and food to sustain my thinking via my life. And after I'm done thinking with the aid of these vital materials, they are transformed and expelled not so much as waste, but as food for the plants and other living beings that in turn create and supply my material needs. I think, therefore I am, we are an ecosystem. And we refer to this then as sustained thought. So again, it's complementary. It's the recognizing the interconnections that are vital to our survival. So Dan, go ahead.
So, as I said at the beginning, a lot of this is very conceptual, maybe pretty abstract. We wanted to talk about those paradigm framing thought strategy ideas and we didn't leave time to talk about the quantitative science that is integrated with all of this. Prior to writing this book together, we'd each been working for 20 some years in ecological network analysis. And so this is all we're going to say about that today, but it's an amazing story. So just a handful of the many discoveries and contributions that have come out of ecological network analysis that fit with this need for a revised paradigm. So when you study whole ecosystems like that one there on the bottom left, the Chesapeake Bay food web, you can see results that you don't get from analytical studies. For example, indirect effects between any two, say a predator and a prey, are often greater and of opposite qualitative impact than the direct effects. You can also study goal functions where ecosystems will strive toward different kinds of trajectories, and those can be seen as complementary. Bob Ulanowitz and also Bernie Patton have contributed hugely in this realm, and one of Bob's findings has to do with that graph down there on the bottom right, that all ecosystems ever studied, the natural ones, converge on this window of vitality at the top of that curve, and they balance efficiency and adaptability. So this is just a few, but there are many of these kinds of quantitative results focusing on stocks and fluxes of energy, carbon, and nitrogen through real food webs that fit with the story that we're talking about today. So moving to summarize, we could propose these two hypothetical pathways, and these are hypotheses that we're seeking discussion and collaboration to revise and test and critique. Two pathways by which the scientific paradigm could cause the global ecological crisis. So the first pathway there on the right on the top has to do with the conventional science paradigm having an overemphasis on discrete life. So when you start there, the next thing that becomes possible is that you can fragment life from its environmental life support context. Once the two have become split apart and fragmented, it becomes possible that the value differential occurs, where life is valued greater than environment. Once you have a differential value, you can then degrade the environment at every successive choice because you're elevating life, and you could think of the distinction between biotic versus abiotic, or you could think of humans versus natural resources. One is always lesser value. Do that 1 million or 1 billion times, and you can get a systemic ecological crisis. The other possible pathway that we're proposing is that the conventional science paradigm focuses on a mechanistic model of nature in the world. So when you start there, you end up with mechanistic technology, applications, and science. Then you can solve problems, you come up with the amazing tools that we have, the amazing discoveries that we have, but many of those are done in a narrow situation or context with many externalities. That's the nature of a machine. It degrades its environment. It's inherently entropic. Do that 1 million or 1 billion times, and you can end up with this emerging crisis where the environment is degraded. The flip side could also be true, that if we revise the paradigm at the center of our science, which is arguably the center of our culture right now, a technological culture, if we had more emphasis of this holistic paradigm in the center, we would have life both as the basis of value and an idea of life as integrated with the environment. Once they're unified, it's not possible to devalue the environment. And so the view is that both human or life environment development will occur in concert with environmental improvement, just like we see with nature. And you could imagine do that a million or a billion times, and we could get a net human environment relationship that's positive and win-win. It's taken us 400 years to get to this crisis situation that we're in. We don't think it has to take us 400 years to turn this around. This is our proposal that we're offering today, and that's really the summary. That's the synthesis, is that we propose looking at the science paradigm. An actionable way to deal with that would begin looking at, in detail, comprehensive effort to examine how the paradigm could help with systemic solutions, and to consider the hypothesis that transforming the paradigm is our greatest source of leverage. We are open to all manner of comments and collaboration, and people to read the book, critique it. We want to revise it for a second edition. And so we'll stop there unless Brian had anything to end on, and just see if there are questions.
No, I'll just hold the book up. When I stop sharing, we could come back to that if there are specific questions that would like to see a slide, or we have some extra slides that could also be useful if questions go in a certain way. But
great, thank you very much to both of you. Well, so now I certainly invite questions, as Dan did. There's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And so there's actually one question there now, so we can get started. But please, everyone who's listening, if you have questions, go ahead and enter those into the question and answers window there. So the first question is, under your holistic life approach, how do you incorporate the humanities or social sciences? Seems very apt to do so. That is from Fuchsia Hoover. That's the same.
Well, that's a great question. There's many ways that are in the book that we didn't really talk about that much. We rely a lot on philosophy, spirituality. The cover art was done by my brother. That was an attempt to use art to get at root metaphors of culture. We also kind of admit that this work needs to have an element integrated that relates to social justice. We didn't talk about that, but to get to a place where environment is improving would help with universal access to a clean environment, right? So it really should be true for everyone that we have clean air and clean water and food and a safe environment.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's part of the story there. We probably gave a more scientific slant of everything, but it's holistic, that we see it as interdisciplinary, and including the social sciences absolutely as key to this. That's another layer of challenge, though, that we welcome people that are experts in those areas to make suggestions.
Well, we have a historian is the next question. It comes from Merle Eisenberg. He likes your approach, but he asks, what is the role of capitalism and colonialism in why we as people have done science in this paradigm? So I guess he's asking what is the role of capitalism and colonialism in forming the paradigm that we currently operate in?
We have a couple of lines throughout the book that refer to the current agricultural food production system, and saying that it takes about 8 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. And so therefore it's not a very efficient food production system as far as that goes. It's only effective at making money for some people. So yeah, we see that as being a goal function that has gotten in the way in some of the directions that we need to be taking. Those transformations of swapping dollars for joules as the currency, a global currency, though, are H.T. Odom tried for decades, right, and unsuccessfully. But we live in that shadow for sure. but yeah, it's interesting. That's also a social sciences question of how we actually get people to do it. Yeah,
My,
go ahead, Dan.
my person that I follow the most on that is Alf Hornborg, who has written a lot about how to have the kind of single currency that we have is connected to the root of all these problems. And I think he's an anthropologist, and he's studied other cultures that don't have a single currency. They have two complementary currencies. And it links to what we're saying about the foundation and value. And if you see everything as substitutable, and that's your value basis, and you only have one, you're going to end up with the same tragedy of the commons. So it's a great point. It's a great point.
Maybe related to that, the next question is, are there certain cultures that better emphasize your holistic life approach? Does your book use examples from maybe different indigenous cultures, for example?
We don't go so much of that into the book, but when we were talking about this, preparing for the seminar, in fact, that we anticipated that question and trying to think of, some indigenous cultures and some other maybe Eastern cultures that have more of the dialectic already as part of their philosophies. But I don't know if there's I don't want to idealize or be naive about places in the world that have really cracked this. But there are places that seem to have done better than we have done. That's for sure. We meaning the kind of Western approach. But Dan, you're actually frozen. I don't know if you want to turn your camera on and off, because I think we can still hear you, but your picture is frozen. Oh, there you are.
There it is.
You're dynamic again. Did you want to add anything about other cultures that?
Sorry if my Wi-Fi blipped out there, something happened. Well, we talked more in the book near the end with examples of applications that can embody this sort of paradigm. And we talked about things like permaculture, regenerative agriculture, biomimicry, or what we could even think of as eco-mimicry. But I do think there are, and Brian, you had a picture of a city, and was it in Czech or Austria, that, an older culture where the people have become more integrated with their environment. But it's another great point. There are examples, and we could learn from those.
So the next question is from Margaret Palmer. She asks, when it comes to the study of mechanisms within the holistic context, as essential to understanding where the levers are to promote positive change. She notes that feedbacks are common in such situations. Do you have any comments on this? I guess how do you treat feedbacks within a very complex system model here,
right.
And you're trying to approach this holistic context.
Right, and I think we would defer to some of Ulanowicz's work, some of Bob's work that he did there with Margaret. He shunned the word mechanism as much as possible, for one thing, and he always talked about processes and not mechanisms, which he felt were too deterministic, and rather they're propensities of systems to do certain things. And in fact, one of the key ideas in our book about how you define sustainability is systems that have autocatalytic cycles. And so there's a strong positive spiraling up of the organizational processes, like closure of efficient cause, if that means anything to anybody. And so you've got, so the feedbacks are absolutely critical. And the fact that positive feedbacks end up driving the system more than negative feedbacks do. Negative feedbacks are just the stabilizers. The positive feedbacks actually get to where you want to be. And Dan referred to that when he mentioned about you do something 1 million or 1 billion times, but that's a positive feedback. And so whether you're doing the right thing 1 million times or the wrong thing 1 million times is going to make the difference in the actual system performance. So yeah, if it didn't come out in our talk, the feedback role is quite critical in the discovery that we had in thinking about sustainability. And another side of that is that not only the positive feedbacks that are spinning up to get you the system that you have, but we refer a lot to also Robert Rosen's work, and where he talks about control loops. And one of the fallback or downfalls, I should say, or he says, is that every time you add a new technology, there's another feedback control loop that has its own costs and its own dependencies that need to be maintained. And so if you're fixing a problem with another technology, that you're just adding other layers of control loops. And so clearly recognizing the role that the feedback is going to be a key part of it. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
So the next question is maybe a short answer, but it's an important question. Would you recommend your book as a sustainability textbook? And if yes, for what level? Undergraduate or graduate or?
Please, yes. I had a Fulbright in Czech Republic last fall, and I used this as a textbook for a seminar class. And we had some really, really good discussions about it. It was a really fun time. And so then when I got back to Towson and they were looking for somebody to lead this graduate seminar this semester, I said, I'm ready to go, and we're doing it right now. So I think it's a great reader for that. It's not so much a textbook like with worked examples and something like that, but I think for a graduate, upper undergraduate level discussion seminar, I'm not just saying that to push the book either, but the students seem to really enjoy it. So
we have also talked about revising it or writing new things to maybe make it more accessible for, say, undergraduate or general audiences. So that is another place where we're looking for collaboration. Somebody wants to, critique it or help us move in that direction.
Great. So the next question is sort of in the category of being the devil's advocate, I think. But what if how do you respond to this statement? More people than ever have enough to eat. There's less conflict than any other time in history. Lower child mortality than ever before. And a lot of this seems to be due to good science. Science provided many of the things that allow this to happen, for those changes to occur. So why would you jeopardize that by changing science?
I'm reading the question out. Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. That's always how you get deeper thinking, is to be both sides of that. I'm not sure that there's less conflict that we could discuss, but I get the point of the question otherwise. And I would say, though, that science has done a pretty good job of being in service of human life. You missed that word in your question, because we know that extinction rates are higher than they've been in historical contexts. And again, it's that idea of we fragmented, and we are solving human problems quite well, but at the expense, because environment is valued less than human life. And so the environment is having crises, and I think that's also pretty well documented. And so so we think there's going to be a point where the environmental life support systems aren't going to be functioning enough to continue to provide those. Maybe there'll be that transcendent leap to the new future that we can't predict yet, but we know that life can persist for long periods of time, doing things that the sustaining way, and so we're trying to incorporate that as much as possible as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I agree, it's a great question, is that a lot of those success stories, they're great success stories, and we talk about examples in the book. My dad got a heart valve replacement. I have an insulin pump. We're not saying get rid of those. We're saying each one of those had externalities, right? And you can either study externalities and find out ways to make policies and incentives to reduce your externalities. But you can also, at the same time, you can look at nature, where there's basically no externalities. The humans and the environment are one system, or the life in the environment is one system, and they improve together. So all we're really saying is just keep track of all of your externalities. If you're going to make a step forward, consider what the damage has been done, and if you follow this this model, there's a possibility that you can solve two problems at the beginning.
Let me address the second question that I see there also about the fraction scientists are already on board is, you know, so as a systems scientist or systems thinker, and it always, I mean, that's just, I see systems and I'm glad I see systems, but, you know, I'm trying to teach systems and teach other people to see systems. And you know, you can turn people on to seeing systems, but I've also, after teaching this for a while, I hate to say it, but it's almost like you get it or you don't get it. And I want to break through that. I want to find the ways to reach everybody so that everybody can make these connections. But my experience is that it's kind of like we're always in a minority. The systems viewers are I don't know what, 10, 15, 20% of the population, probably, whether it's science or the general population, it seems. And I've had some other discussions with other systems teachers that kind of have the same, you know, that it's a minority subset. And again, I think piggybacking on what Dan was saying, what I'm getting at is that, you know, we're not saying to replace the other way of doing science. We're saying that we'd like to see a balance that's more 60-40, 50-50, not 80-20 or 90-10 or something like that. So I would say, to answer that question, we're still a clear minority of scientists that see systems and you know, kind of would advocate these, be receptive to these ideas.
Yeah, great. Yeah, of course, these questions are all related. The next question, though, is kind of interesting from succinct point of view. We talk about socio-environmental systems, and sometimes we use the word human environment interaction, and you're using life environment. Can you speak more about what the difference is between a life environment system and a human environment system?
I could say one quick thing on that. So one of the quotes that we started with near the beginning of the book, I think was attributed to Dwight Eisenhower, who said, to solve a difficult problem, enlarge it, or to solve a complex problem, enlarge it. And so if you're starting out troubled with the human environment system, rather than burrow down into details of the human environment relationship, we went the other way and we went out to the life environment relationship.
Great, thanks. How can we integrate a holistic life science approach to our industrial practices to be able to sustain the needs of the human population without hurting the environment?
I think that refers to, again, I think it's chapter 8 of the book near the end, where we talk about the eco-mimicry and permaculture and some of the approaches that are derived from a holistic life science approach. You know, we recognize that there's scale issues that, you know, is that going to work for 8 billion people? Is it going to work for sustaining the kinds of you know, expected shareholder return that we currently have? And, you know, it's a transformation that it's not, you know, I don't think that, in fact, is on a broader topic about sustainability, a lot of the discussion about sustainability is how to make things less bad. We're talking about how to really make things sustainable. And personally, I don't think there's a way that we just substitute out everything that we're doing now that's bad with something that's good, but continue to do what we're doing now. I just don't think that's going to happen. And I think there has to be some more fundamental transformative changes that, yeah, it's going to be a different world. And so we're saying to build up using these approaches rather than how we built up, as Dan referred to, the last 400 years. I mean, it's not forever in human history, right? The Romans didn't use any fossil fuels. They built some pretty amazing structures. Well, there was no slave labor. There was other things going on as well too. I don't mean to dismiss that, but the energy question, as we say in the book, and as Hubbard said in his Hubbard curve, that the fossil fuel blip is a few centuries essentially, that we happen to be living in that. You know, so ask the question again in 500 years and we'll see what kind of energies we're using, but it won't be fossil fuel. So I'm not really answering the question, I'm sorry, but I'm just saying that I think it's like too stuck in the current way of seeing things that I think it's going to be more dramatic than that, for good or for bad. But
I also wanted to say that what we're suggesting is that science not just try to advise or inform agriculture and energy and transportation and housing, but science needs to lead by example. So we should convert ourselves first. Science could operate sustainably. We could begin to operate on renewable energy and recycling materials processes. And if we did that, that would prove the value of that. It would also prove the value of life as the basis of science. So that to me is a big part of this. Is science has been great at looking outward. What happens if we turn this lens inward and examine ourselves?
Yeah, you don't see that in the broader impact statement of an NSF proposal very often.
Towson is opening up a new science building in the fall, which is a wonderful, it's the new signature building on campus. It's going to be the biggest energy user though on campus, of course, by far. So we're going to be doing sustainability science in a building that is a big energy hog. But what can you do, right? Let me take the next question about ascendancy.
Before you do that, I just want to point
sure.
out though that I put your contact information in the chat window. There was a question later about how do people contact you if they have further questions, and so please check the chat window there for detailed information about their publications and contact information for the panelists.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So yeah, so Margaret asked about Bob Ulanovic's ascendancy ideas. In a couple ways, it's quite important to our thinking in the book. One is that it is one of these ecological goal functions that Dan had referred to, where it's a way of using some quantitative network ideas to understand how ecosystems are developing over time. But more importantly was that if a lot of Bob's work in the mid-90s was promoting this as kind of the goal function, as you could measure ecosystem development using this ascendancy measure. But then later his empirical results started to lean towards another answer, that ascendancy is only part of the question, that that window of vitality curve that Dan showed was actually the balance between ascendancy and redundancy. So ecosystems have been evolving towards this trade-off of being efficient and being redundant in order to deal with the perturbations. And the fact that Bob was able to quickly, even in a way, refute his earlier work was inspirational to us to see that you can flip paradigms, and you can be open to evidence, and you can be open to new things, even if it's contrary to what you'd been spending the last several decades trying to promote. And so it's still a great idea, and it's a key idea as part of the window of vitality, but he was able to let go of a paradigm and grab onto actually a broader one, right, that includes that and something else.
Okay. Well, let's see. I lost track a little bit where we are.
Another one about network analysis, actually. Is that where
you're?
Okay.
So basically, the question is, what can we do now if we're in the field of ecological network analysis? What's limiting us in being able to fully implement this holistic paradigm?
Yeah, another great question. And one of the things, or a couple of things I would throw out immediately would be, a lot of the analysis is based on static network models or steady state network models, right? So there's flows going on, but balanced flows. And so to have a true dynamic network model would be something that would really help, I think, some breakthroughs. And multidimensional networks would also be a good challenge. We tend to deal with one currency at a time, where you can do stacks of overlays of carbon, nitrogen, water, but to analyze the interaction simultaneously of the different currencies and different dimensions would really be a valuable contribution to the field for sure.
I think there are also some still challenges bridging between a lot of the methods that have been developed for ecological network analysis that was started out in natural food webs. And we know that we can apply that to human industrial systems, but to me, it hasn't always been immediately transferable without some changes. So I studied the human food web, the human industrial food system as a network, and it has some strange things going on. So in the Chesapeake Bay food web, you don't have any fish or phytoplankton or jellyfish running on fossil fuels. In the human food supply, you do, so people think it was GM Pietro talks about, you have endosomatic energy that you have to keep track of that's in the body and in the flow of the biology and the ecology, and you also have exosomatic energy, and it's the same thing for other kinds of flows. And that to me was a challenge because it didn't fit easily into, you know, the methods that, say, Bob had developed, Bob Ulanowitz in his ascendancy. I had to do some strange accounting. And sometimes I would equate, you know, a process in a food chain as like a trophic level. Well, is that a valid thing to do? You know, do I count beef meat packing plant as a trophic level? Well, so there's challenges there. I think a lot of real important work to do to get it to be easily transferred, completely transferred.
You might be able to argue that the Chesapeake Bay does have fossil fuels because it has an input of nitrogen and phosphorus from the landscape, which sustains the productivity of the bay.
Yeah, and maybe some of the fish are running on microplastics. Yes, you're right. I shouldn't just draw those lines.
There's a question here and a comment in the chat about sharing science and public engagement in science. And the question is, have you thought of other ways of sharing this paradigm and science in general with all actors? Are there communication mechanisms that you favor or ways of engagement?
Yeah, I feel like I'm still old school. I don't do Twitter or many of those things. I do rely on some of the marketing people at IASA and at Towson, I guess, to get some of the word out. But personally, that's not where I've invested a lot of effort to do. But I know it's important to get the word out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I keep trying to get my teenage kids to help me, and they refuse. But I have seen that somebody took one of Bob Ulanowitz's books and turned it into a kind of a graphic novel. So, you know, I think like young people can help, and creative people, and, you know, people good at communications. We are open for collaborators.
Yeah. I mean, maybe like the concept or the approach of translational ecology would fit in here, where we frame questions and perform research with stakeholders. What skill sets are most important for social scientists to bring into their collaborations with natural scientists if they're going to contribute to the paradigm shift you're talking about?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity and the fortune to work with a number of social scientists over the years, and I probably the fact that they're already coming to the table helps, and they're bringing with them an open-mindedness, and obviously we natural scientists need to bring an open-mindedness. So yeah, that's how I think these discussions start, as people just being curious in the broader context. Where I've seen barriers taking place is on the primacy of like human agency versus the primacy of biogeophysical resource contexts, right? And so it's okay, you know, to have those perspectives and trainings and all that, but to be willing to, again, to let go a little bit and to recognize, you know, that there is a resource base out there that we all depend on, and I. Again, not to be critical, but I think in some cases that's been dismissed as either implicit or irrelevant, and so that's where a lot of the crosstalk takes place, where we're not communicating because they're focused on the human agency side of things and not on the resources. And yeah, so, but it doesn't mean they need to change. We just need to find a way to talk together. So.
Thank you very much for the presentation and fielding so many questions. Thank you to the audience for asking so many interesting questions. I know it shows a high level of engagement, and it's really great to see.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for the discussion.